Okay, as usual, let me start with a review of what we have done so far. So, right now, I will do a review of whatever we have done in the entire book of Ecclesiastes so far. And you will realize a little later that that kind of a review is necessary. We've seen that the critic has been considering various things from the beginning of this book. In chapter number 1, he considered wisdom. Chapter number 2, he considered riches. Chapter number 3, he considered works and tasks. Chapter number 4, he considered success and accomplishments. Chapter number 5, he considered wealth. Chapter number 6, we had a very detailed look at the need of satisfaction. And he found most of these things that he considered to be vanity. And therefore, he began appreciating the value of wisdom, and especially the need of wisdom for satisfaction in life. So we see him considering wisdom carefully in the next chapter, that is chapter number 7. He says that wisdom is required for a better life. That's what we see him considering in chapter 7, wisdom. Now, then he considers another aspect in the next chapter, that is chapter 8. That is the chapter we did last time. So after wisdom, riches, works and tasks, success and accomplishments, wealth, satisfaction and wisdom, he's suddenly considering power. And in that we saw that he was considering the power of a king, the power of the forces, and power of the wicked. And he saw that the common man was subject to these powers, which could arrest or severely overturn their lives anytime. So this is where we stopped last time. This is the review of what we have looked at so far. I didn't go into the details of each of the chapters. You can definitely go back to the audios and listen, or to your notes. I hope you are taking notes. And that's how we reached where we are today. I want to thank everybody who has come back into this study. We are just 4 chapters away from finishing this book. But this chapter, chapter number 9, is a very different kind of a chapter compared to all the chapters we've done so far. And I'll precisely let you know why it is so different. Chapter number 9 is different because of the things that happened after chapter 8. See, till chapter number 6, our critic was considering things that man could achieve or possess. So something which he could run after and finally have for himself. The only problem while considering all these things was that at the end of the day, when he evaluated it, he found that it was vanity. It was smoke. It was hevel. It was nothing. But after considering satisfaction when he comes, and then wisdom when he comes to chapter number 8, when he considered the powers at work around a man, he realized the helplessness before the forces that were affecting him all through his life. The different forces that made man helpless. When the critic saw that, he lost his cool. And we read chapter 9, we can see that the critic is in a phase of desperation. And you will read the chapter and you will find out that he has shifted to fatalism or fatalism. He's shifted his entire tone of speaking, and it's a very different tone that you will see through. So it is it almost stands at the edge of sarcasm, satire, and that's how he has written this book. The scene that comes up in my mind when I read this chapter is that of the guy who has been very silently listening to several things, considering several things, and then something comes up and he bangs the table and he walks away from that room. Or something like this, where there is a class full of students and the teacher is teaching, and then suddenly something comes up in the discussion or in the chapter that the teacher just says, okay, class is dispersed, we are no longer going to consider this subject. Something like that is what I picturized when I saw or read through the verses of chapter number 9. So it's as if this guy, he says that, oh, this is a colossal waste. What I have been doing so far, it's a total waste. Because after considering power, this fellow is not saying that it is vanity. If you look at it carefully, he's calling life vanity, but after considering power, he is calling it evil, unfair and unjust. So we see a frustrated critic in chapter number 9. So whatever you hear now onwards, be careful. Whatever you hear now onwards should not be seen as an ideal response, but you should see it that it is coming out of the frustration of the helplessness of man to help himself. So the critic is actually frustrated when he is making a lot of these conclusions in chapter number 9. Okay, so let's dive into chapter number 9. We will look at the verses in bunches. The first bunch we're going to look at is verses 1 to 6. And remember, the heading is frustration. The critic is speaking out of frustration. Verse number 1 says, "For I considered all this in my heart." What he has talked about, power and all those things. He was considering all that in his heart, and so that I could declare it all, that the righteous and the wise and their works are in the hand of God. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. Now, don't worry about it. If you read all the 6 verses, I'm not reading it right now. I hope you have read it and you are expected to read, because you know which chapter is going to be taken up. I hope you are reading it. Now, when we look at verses 1 to 6, in the powers we discussed in chapter 8, I did say that there are 4 powers considered by the critic in chapter 8. And I'm surprised nobody asked me later on, you said 4, but you only talked about 3. It's okay. The 4th is the power of God. Now, that is what he brings out after considering all those 3 powers: the power of a king, power of the force, the power of the wicked. He talks about the power of God. Now he has brought the impact of that power of God into the forefront, and he says that everything is in the hand of God. And while citing it, he is very upset. If you read the verses below, let's go through verses 2 onwards. It says that all things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and whom who does not sacrifice. As in the good, so is the sinner. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears an oath. He's saying, he's making a list of things to make his case against this helplessness of man. He is really frustrated that this is not right. And he says that irrespective of whichever category you fall into, righteous or wicked, good or unclean, sacrificer or non-sacrificing, whether you are a sinner or righteous, whether you swear or you don't, whatever it is, regardless of your category, same kind of things happen to all. The consequences that you go through in your life are the same. So in the kind of things that happen, there is no differentiation. If somebody has an accident, the other also can have an accident. Somebody gets sick, the other also can get sick. Somebody gets a lottery, the other also gets a lottery. So in the things that happen in his life, there is no pattern. And these things happen without any differentiation that can be made out because of the choices a person makes. So to be righteous is a choice, to be wicked is a choice, to be good is a choice, to be a sinner is a choice. But what the critic says is, what's the difference of making a choice? Because at the end of the day, anything happens to anyone. You know? So he ends up, after this discussion, in verse number 3, he says, this is evil. Verse number 3 begins by saying, this is an evil in all that is done under the sun. Let me delve a little into that. So when the critic says that this is evil, he's actually making an accusation against God, because he just mentioned about the power of God, and then he says that this is evil. He's actually calling God out for doing evil under the sun. Isn't that amazing? I want to just hold your thought there and think about it. Because when I thought about it, I was just in awe of this God, a God that gives so much of freedom to his people. Remember, this is his book, this is God's book. And one of his own people was ascribing evil unto God. And God has allowed it to be written for the generations that come later to see it. And I was just thinking, if it was any other book, if it was any other author, such things would be removed. It wouldn't be there in the book. Similarly, God allows the weaknesses of his servants to be written. We know what are the weaknesses of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Moses or David, because it was allowed in the book. Though they are biblical heroes, their weaknesses are also mentioned. So all this is allowed because the God of the Bible is the ultimate reality and the truth. So he is not afraid of aspersions that are cast on him. He is not afraid of misunderstandings, or he is not even afraid of weaknesses of his servants that it can affect him. He is true, and what he stands for is the truth. And that will in the end stand tall, irrespective of who or what may come against it. And that's why the Bible boldly allows things like this to be there mentioned. How can the critic, who is Solomon, who was blessed by God to have wisdom, at the end or in the middle of his life, look at God and say, God, this is evil. But it is allowed and he speaks it. I'm not saying that we should do it, but I'm just pointing this out to tell us that the Bible is a true word of God. It is not been fiddled with. Things have not been changed. Whatever is mentioned there as is, so that we know that it has come without any manipulations straight into our hands. Now, I also want to make you think about why is the critic suddenly so frustrated, why is he so upset. See, we can see that the critic is upset because for so many chapters he was trying to think through reason, logic. He was looking at so many options, different aspects of everything that man was running after. He was actually building a case, and through all the previous chapters that we looked so far, he was trying to look at things in a systematic way and try to find an optimal way, an optimal pathway for all of us who are after him. So he wanted to look, he was the wisest. So he said, let me go through life, let me look at everything, and let me tell you which is the optimal path to take. So he was going at that, and I think he felt that he almost found that optimal path, which could be the best way to. And that's why chapter 7 he starts off with his Beatitudes. So he was almost there. He felt that I've got that answer. I know how to live life. That's when chapter 8 happens. And then he suddenly realizes, my God, how can there be an optimal way? Because these powers do anything to anybody. How can we are totally helpless? How can we predict what will happen tomorrow? So he got upset because of that. Now, when we come to the second part of verse 1, in verse 9, chapter 9, he says that people know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. Now, this is a very interesting observation. Why? Because he's talking about the hand of God in everything. And then he says that people cannot make the difference between love or hatred in what they see. So what he's saying is that there is a powerful God out there. And this is clearly visible. People can see it. That's why Romans says that his divine character and his mighty power is visible in nature, so that man is without excuse. So man can observe. He can look around and he can construe by observing things around him and observing life that there is a powerful God. However, what the critic says is, What man cannot make out is what are the intentions of this powerful God. It is not possible to make out from what can be seen or what he does to people in life. It's not possible to make out that this same powerful God also loves us. It's not possible to know whether he hates us, whether he is merciful. These kind of attributes of God cannot be seen by observing. Now, that is not revealed in nature. You cannot look at nature and say, oh, I think God is a very loving God. You will only see that God is a very intelligent, very powerful, all-knowing God. But you cannot see those attributes of God in nature which actually we look out for. We want His love, we want His mercy, we want His grace. Those things are not seen in nature. So, what seems is that God does whatever He wants. He's powerful, but anything else about God is very difficult to find out. Now, when he says that, we should remember that this is a pre-Jesus understanding of life. Ecclesiastes was written at a time which was probably about 800 to 1000 years before, maybe more before the time of Jesus. So when he's writing that, there is no Jesus in front of him. He's not considered Jesus so far. So therefore, as a naturalist or a humanist, is taking this position that we can only see the power of God in nature and nothing else. Today, when we look at it, we can see the power of God in God the Father and in all of creation. Today, we can see the love of God in God the Son and in His Son Jesus Christ, who was crucified on the cross for all of our sakes. Today, we can see the reconciliation to the Godhead possible through God the Holy Spirit. So this is all a privilege and a blessing for us. So we are more wiser than Solomon in those terms. So we will now move ahead. Now the critic looks at all these and he says that men respond to this in different ways. And he is now going to list the different responses of men to life. So when we come to verse 3, we see that he says that truly the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil. Madness is there in their hearts while they live. After that, they go to be dead. When man realizes that he is helpless, whatever he has gained, he can lose any time. And there are so many forces that bring randomness into his life. He may not wake up tomorrow. What he does is he tries to escape this reality. The reason he does that is because of, the critic says the hearts of men are evil and their madness, and there is madness in their hearts when they are alive. So what they do is they escape the unpredictability and the randomness by escaping from reality. How? By partying, by drugs, alcohol, other addictions. They escape the reality. And this is one of the ways that man chooses to respond. Now, this path comes easily to those who are given into evil and pleasures. They will choose this way. When they realize, hey, yaar, kal ka kya hai, aaj ka kya hai, when they suddenly realize they are helpless, their hearts which are full of evil and which is full of madness will tell them, go have fun, get lost, forget about this reality and get lost. So the first response of men is to escape. Now when we read verse number 4, it says that, but for him who is joined into all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. Now here he brings out the second response. This is another thing men do when they see all these powers making helpless. Critic suggests this reasonable thing that a man should do, an option which is far better than escaping. The first response was escape. The second response is endure. He asks, isn't a dog who is alive better than a lion which is dead? So what he is saying is, as long as man is alive and he has breath, he should salvage all that he can. He may not be the strongest, he may not be the wisest, he may not be the best that can be, but he is alive. I repeat that. He may not be the strongest, he may not be the wisest, he may not be the best, but he is alive. And when he is alive, he is better than a dead lion. And if you read that verse ahead, it says, nothing can be done after death captures. So man should make the most of the time that he is alive. The living can know and feel. The living can hope for a reward. The living understand love, hatred, envy, etc. The dead know nothing. So what the critic suggests is that men should hang on to hope and endure whatever comes to them in life and somehow make it to the end of it. This is a better option to escaping. They respond in the best way they know they can, and though it is not the best response around them, it is better than escaping into evil or being paralyzed by fear. That brings us to verse number 7. And verse number 7 says, go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, and let your head lack no oil. Live joyfully, this is verse 9, live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he has given you under the sun, all your days of vanity, for that is your portion in life, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or device or knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you are going. So now we see the third response. First was escape, second was endure. The third response of men to his helplessness is enjoy. The critic suggests the best thing the man can do. Now remember, he is talking in his frustration. So he is saying that यार अभी हम मजबूर हो गए, हम कुछ कर नहीं सकते, इतना हेल्पलेस, हम इतने मजबूर है, बेबस है, क्या करें, यू नो. सो जाओ यार, कुछ लोग तुम एस्केप कर लो, पर उससे अच्छा तो एंड्योर है. बट मैं सोचता हूँ उससे अच्छा है कि एंजॉय कर लो. So that's how he goes. The thought process is going like that. He's kind of frustrated and making these suggestions. And he says, if life allows the luxuries, then he says there are things that a man should do, which we read in verses 7 to 10. Eat his bread with joy. So now, though he is citing bread, it is just to indicate that it may not be much, but salvage whatever you can. Drink and enjoy the time that you have got in your hands. Wear comfortable garments. Use oil on your head to remain fresh and healthy and to enjoy each day. Enjoy the company of your wife. Do all you can with all your might. There is no work, there is no know-how, no tools, nor wisdom in the grave. There is no need of these things in the grave. So according to the critic, the best way for men is to enjoy life irrespective of how painful or discriminating life might seem. And there's an interesting observation in verse number 7. He says that God has already accepted your works. So what he's saying is, again out of his sarcasm and frustration, he's saying, God will anyways do what he wants, irrespective of whether you do good or bad. God has already factored that in. He will only do whatever he wants. Whatever you do has already been incorporated into his scheme of things. So none of these things can be done once you die. So therefore, do it. They are available to be done only when you are alive. So do it. That's what the whole tone of the critic is till verse number 10. So that brings us to verses 11 and 12. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill, but time and chance happen to them all. Now, he goes on to list a few more things that he viewed as senseless. That the fastest people don't always win the race. The strongest people don't always win the battle. The wisest people don't always get the bread. The people with the most understanding necessarily do not become rich. The most skillful do not find favor. What does he say? Time and chance happen to everyone. Time and chance happen to everyone. That means there is a time demarcated for things to happen, and that the chance talks about that event, that occurrence. So it is just like a game of dice. If the dice falls and the number is right, then you get it. You got a lottery last month and now you won a lottery again. Time and chance, what people usually call as luck or fortune. But I want you to be aware of this fact that there is no place for chance in God's universe. I want to clarify it, though the critic is making this point. When he says chance, it's like a random event that happened out of accident, like evolution, how it happened. Nobody was in control, it just happened. It's a happenstance. That's what he means by the word chance. But in God's universe, there is nothing called chance. God is in control of all the major and minor incidents or occurrences. What that means is that God has paid attention and has given approval to everything that happens. Once again, God's attention and approval is there on everything that happens. How can God do that? He is omniscient, He is omnipotent, He can do that. Nothing happens as a surprise to God. So there is no space for chance in Christian theology, in God's universe. See, but for the critic, in the general scheme of things, it didn't really generally matter much that you were swift or strong or wise or skillful or a person with understanding. Things will happen by chance in your life or they never will. So he just left it there to time and chance. And then when we read verse number 12, he says that for man also does not know his time. Like fish taken in a cruel net, like birds caught in a snare, so the sons of men are snared in an evil time when it falls suddenly upon them. Now he's suddenly talking about death. So we see that we were talking about that three filters of time and death and randomness. Solomon was not very perturbed by time. He was not very perturbed by death also, because he knew that's a sure eventuality. But what threw his mind out of gear is unpredictability, randomness, no logic, no reason to what happens under the sun. That is what threw him out. Now he is really trying to make a sense of what's happened. So now he's just discussed time. Now he's discussing death. One thing, however, is sure to happen: death. It comes cruelly like a net to trap the fish. It comes cruelly like a snare to catch the birds. It comes suddenly and ends everything in a snap. That's what he says. And then let's look ahead what happens. So that brings me to the last part of chapter number 9. And verses 13 to 17. When we read, we find out that the critic is now slowly cooling down. His frustration is over and he is now trying to come back into his senses. And he starts talking about something which he has been talking about in chapter number 7. And he picks up wisdom. He picks up on a negative note, but he ends it up on a positive note. He talks about wisdom and he says, see, listen, there was a little city with few men in it, and a great king came against it, besieged it, and built great snares around it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he by his wisdom delivered the city. So there's this mighty king who came, and they were almost going to be taken, but there was a poor wise man, and he gave his wisdom and delivered the city. But look at what happened. That poor wise man was not remembered by anybody. After driving the king away, the city settled back to its old ways. They didn't even remember this fellow. That is the least people can do to show gratefulness. Remember. We always like that, right? He remembered me. When there is a wedding, he remembered me. When there was an event in his life, he remembered me. We value remembrance and memory in a great way. He said, this fellow, he rescued the entire city, but they forgot him. Even that remembrance wasn't done. Its contribution was not acknowledged. It was not celebrated. And the critic says, what is the use of wisdom? People forget the benefits of wisdom. Even if it saved their very lives. I mean, wisdom is good for the person who has it, but for those around it, it is nothing. They do not value it. They only value it as far as it gains them something, but after that, it is not valued. So, in a sense, the critic cools down, but he says that, okay, let's go back to where I was. I got a little carried away, but let me go back to wisdom. As far as I am alive on this earth, there is one thing I need for sure, be it randomness, or be it death, or be it time that happens to me, or be it what I call it chance. But what I need all the time is wisdom. So he's coming to that, but then he first has a defiance towards this thing. Koi yaad nahi karta, nobody remembers a wise man. But then he settles down and then he says, then I said, verse number 16, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. Words of the wise spoken quietly should be heard, rather than the shout of a ruler of fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. Interesting. Whether people appreciate it or understand it or not, the critic has come to this place. He is saying, according to him, wisdom is better than strength. Wisdom is superior and should be heard the loudest, even above every other voice. Wisdom is better than any weapon of warfare. The reason why people do not value wisdom or neglect it is because one sinner can bring down everything. That takes years for wisdom to build up. Years of diligence and hard work can be pulled down by one sin. Years of wisdom can be lost by one act of foolishness. So wisdom, though good, is failed by that one sinner. Wisdom is good, but a wise man with that one sin can make wisdom look like foolishness. And suddenly there is a eureka moment in the mind of the critic, and he realizes he is that sinner. He is that one sinner who was going to destroy whatever he had built up to chapter number 8. In his frustration, in his helplessness, in not being in control of things, he was suddenly in a place where he was now going to destroy every case he had built up. All his conclusions in every chapter was going to be brought down because of his frustration. He realizes it. He says that the critic says, I don't want to be that fool, that sinner in that frustration who destroys everything. One sinner who destroys much. I don't want to be that man. He comes back to where he was at the end of chapter number 7. So this is an interesting chapter, where he's actually going through an emotional turmoil, and we are allowed to see, take a look at the topsy-turvy nature of his arguments in his mind, and it's quite interesting. And we ourselves go through such struggles in our minds, but at the end of the day, we have to cool down. Emotions can't play with us. We have to control them, and when we cool down, we will see things in perspective, just like Solomon saw. In haste, we can sin. In haste, we can sin. And though he talks about it in chapter 8, he himself made a haste here and he sinned. But he realized that, with this one sin, I can destroy much good. And he comes back. So that's the end of chapter number 9. God bless you. We'll come back next Monday.